Hello, I'm Jennifer Keller, Programming Coordinator at the Westport Library. It is my honor today to introduce two big names in business, Jeff Immelt and Steve Parrish, who will be discussing Jeff's new book, Hot Seat: What I Learned Leading a Great American Company. These two men have extensive biographies, so I will be giving you some highlights for both. Jeff Immelt is the former chairman of General Electric and served as CEO for 16 years. Currently, he is a partner at NEA, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a lecturer at Stanford University. Mr. Immelt has received several honorary degrees and awards for business leadership, and even chaired the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness under the Obama administration. Steve Parrish is the founder of Steve Parrish Consulting Group, LLC. Prior to this, Steve was a senior vice president of Altria Group, Inc., and was responsible for the Altria family of companies, government relations, communications, issues management, corporate philanthropy, and corporate compliance. Steve actively supported proposals to grant the Federal Food and Drug Administration authority to regulate the tobacco industry, which is documented in the national bestseller, A Question of Intent. So without further ado, gentlemen, take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good evening. And thank you, Jeff, for joining us. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
You too, Steve. Thanks.
Your book is, for me, was a fascinating account of your time at GE, particularly your time as CEO. And you had a phrase in the book toward the end where you said truth equals fact plus context, which I thought was a great way to describe what you did in the book, which was to provide a very honest, no holds, but very respectful story of what happened. And we obviously don't have time to cover everything that's in the book, but of course, that's why people need to buy the book and read it. But so what I thought we could do tonight, Jeff, is spend some time on some of the key events that really jumped out at me in the book, as well as some of the topics that I thought were fascinating analyses on your part, but also very relevant to what's going on in the country and in the world today. So let me jump right in. And start with a quick story that wasn't in the book, but I met you briefly in January of 2001. And you had just been named Jack Welch's successor, hadn't taken over yet, but I think it was in November of 2000 when you were named as Jack's successor. And I remember I congratulated you on your new job, and I asked you what it was like to go through this succession process that GE had used to choose Jack's successor. And in your book, you described that succession process as a very public, grueling three-way runoff to determine who would be Jack Welch's successor. You described it as an all or nothing cage match among Jack's most trusted lieutenants. And when the succession process was announced, it was also made very clear to the world that the two men who did not get the top job were going to be expected to leave GE. So the night that we met, I asked you what it was like to go through that. And I don't recall your exact words, but you were very diplomatic and basically said, oh, it wasn't as bad as it might have seemed. You talk more about it in the book. But the other thing I thought about was I've often wondered, especially as I read your book, during that period of time between your announcement as Jack's successor and the time you actually became chairman and CEO, what was on your mind in terms of what you wanted to do when you took over, how you wanted to do it, and when you wanted to do it? So could we start with you maybe walking us through what was going on?
Yeah, Steve. So thanks. It's great to be with you. I think because the succession process was so public, and I wasn't used to being that kind of public player. It made it quite uncomfortable. And to your point, I've been asked about it for the last 20 years, which is probably not a good thing. You know, these things probably should be in the background, not in the foreground, in terms of how companies make change. But I had about 9 months after I was named, kind of heir apparent before Jack really formally retired. And really, it was the first time I had a chance to actually work with him and be able to ask things that were on my mind. So I really spent those 9 months, kind of talking about people and situations with Jack, getting myself around the company to see different, people and situations and things like that. I tried to kind of mentally set some priorities that I thought were going to be important for the company. So I think in some way, shape, or form, prioritizing technology, working on globalization, getting closer to customers, being more diverse from an HR standpoint, those things I kind of formulated in those, let's say, 9 months, right, that we had together, and then tried to find a voice that could move the company forward while acknowledging what a big player Jack was on the global stage. The other thing I would say, Steve, is look, I had never really been to a GE board meeting before I was named heir apparent, something that's changed dramatically in the subsequent 20 years. So just getting to know the board members and how governance worked and things like that, I just was starting at ground zero on a lot of those things.
So it wasn't just the way the succession process unfolded, but it was also the man you succeeded. Jack Welch, the iconic Jack Welch, I think was named by one of the business magazines as the CEO of the century. And when I think of Jack Welch, I think of a couple of things. One was he never missed his numbers, which was always a bit baffling to a lot of us in the business world about how it could be so precise every quarter after quarter after quarter. But also, for some reason, I think of Six Sigma when I think of Jack Welch. So during this time, I know you had to at least have in the back of your mind what it was going to be like to succeed Jack Welch. And in your book, you tell a story that it's humorous, but it has a point, which is you were on a golf outing in Chicago.
Yeah, I every year, even today, play a round at a golf course in Chicago with 3 friends. I was in the locker room. This was in August of 2001. I'm changing my shoes, and one of the members says, "Who are you?" And I say, I'm Jeff Immelt, and he says, "What do you do? Where do you work?" And I say, "I work at GE." He says, GE. I feel sorry for that poor son of a bitch that's taking Welch's job. So we laughed about it. We laughed about it all day. Look, Steve, people read the book, and they frequently people read the book in terms of what I said or didn't say about Jack. I thought he was a great CEO. In the 80s and 90s, GE did extremely well, but it was run a certain way. I would say, it was the growth of GE Capital was really the engine of growth. And, management processes were really let's say the foundation of the company. And it's not that those things aren't important, even important today, but I felt like we had walked past lots of technologies that could have been important to the company. I felt like we weren't really a global company. We didn't have really strong customer relations. We had good leaders, but not many diverse leaders. And so there were things that I just felt like in the 21st century, were going to be very different from the world that we lived in. And that was the task, was not saying he was good, bad, or any other way, other than had done a great job. But I think we all knew that the company had to really modify our portfolio, our business practices, and things like that in order to be successful. And look, driving change, one of the things that people that read the book will see is that driving change at scale isn't easy. It takes determination, and some people come with you, some people don't. And that was really the task we had at GE.
So you touched on a couple of things there that I hope we get a chance to come back to. One was GE Capital, and the other was innovation. And this is my words, not yours, but what one of the things that came across to me in the book was your passion for innovation and fostering a culture of innovation in the company. But before we get there, going back quickly to January 2001, when I met you, there was a lot you knew about the company. You'd been with GE your entire career and in a number of very important senior positions, but there were things you didn't know. And in fact, in January 2001, there were things none of us knew, one of which was going to change the world forever and was going to have an enormous impact on you and your company. So your first Monday on the job, September 10, 2001, what was going on with you on that day?
Yeah, I did an all-employee televised broadcast with Sue Herrera on CNBC on September 10th. I got on a plane and flew to Seattle, where I was going to be speaking at Boeing the next day. I got up on September 11th and went down to the fitness center and saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center. And that started really an incredible series of events that impacted the world, certainly impacted the US, and certainly impacted our company, that just came right front and center from the first minute of the first day, almost, of the work we had to do. Steve, I would say that people of my generation, we had never seen a tail risk event. We had never seen something so unexpected and so catastrophic. So none of us really had a sense for what crisis truly looked like. And that was really a challenge. I think, there's certain elements of crisis that you learn, kind of on the fly as these things happen, that leaders absorb fear, that you have to make decisions, that you have to hold two truths, that bad things can happen, but don't give up on the future. And those things came to place. But if you take September 11th and go out 60 days, the leadership team had to make a series of billion-dollar decisions about loaning airlines money, doing restructurings, investing in technology that really were unexpected. And to a certain extent, the combination of 9/11 and then Enron and then the end of the bubble economy, this kind of put a bookmark in certainly the economic history that said basically the 2000s were going to be very different than the 1990s.
So you talk in the book about the fact that despite the incredible success of this iconic corporation, as a senior executive in the company, even before you became CEO, you knew there were, I think the word you used, there were headwinds, even before 9/11. But then, of course, 9/11 and the impact it had on particular parts of the GE portfolio was pretty dramatic. Talk just a little bit about that before we move on.
The company of 2001, Steve, was like 50% financial, 50% industrial. The GE Capital was really filled with a lot of really good people and businesses. On the industrial side, we'd just gotten tired, I would say. Half of our earnings came from selling one product, which were large gas turbines, in one market, which was the US. So we didn't have really a very robust and diversified technical pipeline or set of ideas that were going to drive us forward in the future. Then 9/11 hits, and it takes maybe our best business, which was aviation, and puts it on the bench for, we didn't know how long, maybe forever, but certainly a few years. And so the board and I, kind of made the decision in 2002 and 2003 that we had to make some big bets on, healthcare, media, aviation. We needed to do them right away. In order to fund those, we needed to keep the cash flow coming from GE Capital. So we basically did a pivot from having the industrial cash fund GE Capital growth to maybe having cash from GE Capital fund industrial growth. And so what we say in the book around 2003 and 4 is that this was just a lot of reinvestment back in the company that the board and the leadership team had to do. So, we had problems going into 9/11, but 9/11 made most of the challenges we had significantly worse than they would have been had we not had that catastrophic event.
I was going to get into this later, but maybe it's worth a moment for you to talk a little bit about the corporate structure of GE in 2001 when you took over.
Yeah, I think what's unique about a conglomerate is that, not only do you have different businesses, and to a certain extent, GE of 2001 will probably never be seen again, going from media to healthcare to aviation to financial, we had a pet insurance business and everything in between, all with the same balance sheet, right? So whereas private equity is diverse, every business has its own capital structure. We had one capital structure, and that served us well for a long time, but provided lots of complexity as it pertains to how investors would see us and things like that. I remember, Steve, when 9/11 happened, the market was closed for a week and the market opened on a Monday, and our largest investor sold half their stake, which just crushed the stock. They owned $4 billion of stock. And I called the portfolio manager and said, really, slow down a little bit. The company's fine. We're going to do well. And he said, we weren't aware that you were that big in the insurance business. And you say, look, you own $4 billion of stock and you didn't know what you're investing in. Give me a break. And so to a certain extent, that's the challenge of, I would say, our big company, but almost every big company is making sure you're transparent enough and that perception and reality match both inside the company and outside the company. So that's, we were at a moment in time that probably will never be replicated again, of having a company that big, that diverse, all with the same, let's say, financial statements and balance sheet.
So your comments about the financial services part of the company is a great segue into the next big event that I wanted to talk a few minutes about, which is the global economic crisis in 2008 and beyond. So give us sort of the context along with the facts of how that unfolded with respect to GE.
Yeah, so we made a decision in the early 2000s to keep growing financial services while we were catching up on the industrial business, and we made a ton of progress on let's say our industrial portfolio. We were entered into life sciences and avionics and a bunch of really great businesses, but we also let GE Capital grow, and that was my decision and on me. And so when you go to 2007, 2008, actually the company's financials were really good, were strong, stock prices working, things like that. But when the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy took place and the era of kind of 2008 and 2009 and 2010, the financial crisis, there's probably no company more impacted than GE Capital. And it wasn't really that we were, in really bad businesses or had been doing things wrong. We were just too big. So we were the biggest finance company in the world. We were kind of funded by debt that we would then, loan money to people at a higher spread. And, those markets got crushed in the financial crisis. So bondholders got hurt. They pulled back. It was harder for us to operate. We had to generate cash to bolster the balance sheet. And I would say, look, see, COVID is horrible because of the impact that it had on human life. And 9/11 was awful because of just the impact it had on the world. But if you were in financial services, the month of September and October of 2008 have no peer in terms of just sheer shock. And, you know, I tell the story in the book, and you and I were talking earlier, you know, probably the end of September of 2008, Washington Mutual went bankrupt and the bondholders got wiped out. And we decided to do a $15 or $18 billion equity raise the next Monday. We had 48 hours to plan it. And this all happened on a Friday. And I called a board meeting Saturday morning, telephonic. There was no Zoom or anything like that. So we couldn't see each other. It was just my CFO, my general counsel, and me. And I start the board meeting by saying, hey guys, you know, it's pretty rocky out there. We're going to go raise $18 billion on Monday. And dead silence on the phone. And finally, Roger Pinsky, who was just a great director, Roger shouts out, let's go get the money. And then everybody says, let's go. I think if Roger hadn't said that, we'd still be in that board meeting today. We'd be there 10 years later, and we raised the equity, you know, made the company safe. But there are just a dozen decisions like that as you go through the financial crisis that you had to make with imperfect knowledge. I would say, you know, when I think back on it, or I think about it today, I was so proud of the team. The board and the team worked together. We made many good decisions, and we got criticized every day, right, Steve? So we got trashed in the media, we got trashed in the press every day. And I just think if you're, you know, kind of one of the reasons why I wrote the book is because today all leadership is crisis leadership. And I just think it gives people a sense that, you know, you've got to make decisions that are unpopular. You got to take the heat. And that's what we were doing a lot of during the financial crisis.
The chapter in the book on the financial crisis and the way you told the story, it's almost like what my friends in the news media call a TikTok. I found to be riveting. And that chapter alone, for me, it was worth the price of the book. But there's a lot more there. We talked a minute ago about GE's corporate structure, and you mentioned that it's a conglomerate. And over the years, conglomerates have been viewed as a positive way to place to invest your money, and then other years, not so much. What do you think about the nature of the conglomerate as a way to run a business or businesses? Is that a good thing or not? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the argument can be made that if you really have, I'd say, technical or market advantage by having complexity of multiple businesses, conglomerates still work, right? I think they need to be narrower than they were maybe in the past. And really, you need to demonstrate to investors that you can leverage the capability. So what I would argue is that the fact that we had a multi-business structure really made us a much better global company than anybody else. And I would argue that in our era, we were a fantastic global company, but the fact that we could do more than one thing helped us gain advantage. The interrelations of technologies between healthcare, aviation, power, things like that, that's a huge advantage and would show up in market share and margins and various things that are economically valuable. And really throughout, you know, we did dispositions and acquisitions and everywhere in between. But, you know, at the end of 2016, we still traded at a premium to the sum of the parts. But a lot of things are different now, Steve. You know, in other words, investors you really have a professional investor class today that want to build their own portfolios. They want simpler stories. And so the whole notion of kind of like being an investor today is different than it was 10 or 20 years ago. So I think, you know, very narrow, interconnected, technically based conglomerates can still work. Now, the last point I would make is that, you know, Amazon is a conglomerate and Alphabet is a conglomerate, and they work today because they have very strong technical capability that spans their company. And so I think whereas management practices were what made conglomerates work in the 1980s and 90s, what makes a conglomerate today is really very strong fundamentals around artificial intelligence and other technologies. And so that's the only word, that's the only kind of word of warning I would say, is that, we live in an era where technology matters.
So just because you're a conglomerate doesn't mean you have to operate in a certain way. And I know you talk about this in the book, this trying to figure out the right balance between centralized decision-making and overall oversight, and decentralized, maybe perhaps more nimble decision-making. How did you struggle with that?
Yeah, no, I think there's no static answer to that. There's the Berkshire Hathaway way that is very decentralized, but I would argue it's really centralized. It's actually Warren, and to a certain extent, he creates the glue of the company in the most centralized way, but he runs it in a very decentralized way. I think private equity is a good example of centralized and decentralized. I think the ebb and flow is always really, if there's not some central value added through either backroom synergies or scale, you're probably better off breaking the company up and having it be in different businesses. So doing that just enough, but not too much, is the constant kind of ebb and flow of, driving simplicity inside the organization, which I talk about inside the book. And so you have to constantly be looking at metrics like unallocated corporate cost, overhead, how many touch points does each decision make, how many layers of management have you created? And I think you need to chop away at those categories in order to make sure that you're not overcomplicating every decision. The fact is, Steve, is that, look, we had 70% market share in commercial aviation. We had 50% market share in power. We had 40% market share in healthcare. We had 70% market share in locomotive. In other words, the things we were doing were working in the marketplace, but sometimes we made it so that we could, just made it too complicated, too costly to get there. So I just think there's a constant ebb and flow of decisions in terms of how much corporate is too much, and how little means that you'd be better off breaking away. The last point I'd make is, look, a business that's near and dear to my heart is the appliance business. GE invented the appliance business and was in it for decades. I worked there. I cared about it, right?
You learned how to fix refrigerators, right?
I learned how to fix refrigerators, exactly. But it is so much better run as an independent company as it was inside GE today, right? So I think you can't let your ego get in the way of understanding that sometimes things are better. We sold businesses, Steve, that actually GE ran better than the person we sold them to. But we also were pretty realistic about the fact that, Comcast could do for NBC what we couldn't do, right? A dedicated appliance company could do for things that, we couldn't do. But at the same time, we had a silicones business that worked inside GE. We sold it, didn't work at all, right? So, understanding your swim lane is really key when you run a conglomerate.
Okay, I'd like to switch gears for a minute and talk about something that I think probably has changed a bit since you were running GE, and that's this notion of what I call business advocacy. And it's gotten a lot of attention lately, particularly with respect to Georgia and proposals to change the voting eligibility issues and stuff in that state. And I'm not going to ask you to weigh in on that particular issue, but it does seem that when it comes to politics and public policy, leaders of business these days are expected, have different expectations that maybe than they did 15 or 20 years ago.
Yep.
Love to have your perspective on that.
Yeah, look, this has changed big time. I would say when I took over the company in 2000 or 2001, we were actually discouraged from going to Washington or Brussels or things like that. And today, it's on the roadmap of every business leadership team in the country. So this has changed dramatically, number one. Number two, I'd say, Steve, look, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you have to realize that between the financial crisis and COVID, government's not your partner, right? They bailed out the financial crisis. They've given out $4 or $5 trillion during COVID. And so it's not like people can take the money and every time the government gives more money, the stock market goes up. So it's not like people can sit there and say, well, we don't want you in our hair, Mr. and Mrs. Government, because we're the private sector. Public and private will intersect for a generation because of these crises and the way they've been handled, the way they've been managed. So you just have to get over it as a business leader. The last thing I'd say is, look, when I was working at GE, we had Republicans and Democrats in our employee base, our customer base, and investor base. So for a company to pick sides, it's really hard. And to enter the political debate where you're viewed as picking a political side, you just better do it with real judgment and real dedication and from a position of strength as you do that. Now, certain things are wrong, right? And when certain things are wrong, business leaders are expected to speak up and be counted, right? So there's things I love the country, but certain things in the country don't work. And there's nothing wrong for business leaders to use their voice when they need to. When President Trump put in the Muslim travel ban, I came out singularly and loudly to say I didn't think that was right. When we backed out of the Paris Climate Accord, I spoke up very loudly on those things. But I didn't do it every day of the week, Steve. I didn't do it on every issue. I didn't do it on every day of the week. And I think it's important for leaders to use, judgment that when they weigh in, their voice matters, that people look at them singularly, and that they understand both the law, the issues, and know them very well. And there's just no way to avoid it today in an era where government is your partner, whether you like it or not.
Let me ask you about something that you seem to feel very strongly about in the book, and that's eco-imagination. Tell us what that is and what that was about.
Yeah, one of the advantages of a conglomerate is you can look out across multiple divisions simultaneously. And I think it allows you to pick up trends that are better and bigger and faster, and you can get there before others. I think the notion we had around eco-imagination is that investing in kind of climate technologies could be profitable for the company and solve problems. And to a certain extent, we were early. We were probably a decade before, at least 5 years before other companies. Now everybody does it, and as a result, we built a very big wind turbine business and energy efficiency business and things like that. I think we tried to help influence public policy. Getting good public policy in the whole energy space has really been hard and remains hard today because it's really an ecosystem. You see that in Texas, this winter, and, you see it from a standpoint of, I used to live in Connecticut, in Fairfield County, like you do, Steve, and the fact that all the power lines are above ground and you lose electricity every time the wind blows. There's no easy way around that other than investing more money. So I think this whole notion of infrastructure in the US and doing it in a productive way, I hope if we make these investments, we do these in a way that can actually get the country understanding the energy ecosystem and ways to fix it. Look, I live half the year in California. California is the most energy, let's say, sensitive state in the country. And our energy practices stink. Nobody would want to follow what California does. So, we truly need some public-private leadership in this space.
Another topic that you spend a pretty significant amount of time on in the book is globalization.
Yep.
And your thoughts on what globalization really means and what that means for the future and how businesses think about the future?
Yeah, we went, in just the time that I was CEO, from being, 70% of our sales in the US to 70% of our sales outside the US. And it wasn't so much that we were changing the businesses we're in as much as it was that's where the customers were. And so, really critical aspect of globalization. But while we're making that change, the nature of globalization really changed. If you look at the 90s or even the early 2000s, trade deals were kind of like viewed as being a positive. Getting China in the WTO was viewed as being a positive. The Exim Bank was viewed as being a positive. None of those things exist today. I would say globalization is only associated with outsourcing. It generally has has left a bad taste in people's mouths in the US and around the world. And, President Trump didn't invent protectionism. He Americanized it, but protectionism was going on in Europe and Latin America and China and other countries around the world for decades. So I think we live in a world today that doesn't believe in this interconnected global community. It's kind of like every country for themselves. That's not going to change quickly, so you better get used to it. But if you're a business person, if you're GE or IBM or Microsoft or anybody else, going to global markets still matters, right? That's still the way you have to grow your company and be competitive. So today, globalization is localization. It means that you need to build factories in Brazil or Germany or Africa or other places that you want, or China, other places you want to sell. But you have to be part of the local fabric of every market that you're in. You have to delegate more. You have to empower more. And companies that are willing to do that are going to be successful. But if you're waiting for, if we're waiting for President Biden to do a transatlantic big trade deal that you're going to like as a business person, I think you're going to wait a long time, right? And that's that's just kind of the state of globalization. It's not the way I wish it was, Steve, but it's the way it is. And I think sometimes globalization was one of those things where I saw the world I wanted to believe go away and a different place emerge. Now, business people should have seen this 10 years ago. Really, anybody that has a sole source factory pre-COVID in China that was making products for everywhere in the world, and you only had one factory and it was in China, you had to have your head examined. You weren't reading or watching or seeing anything that was going on in the world. So I think business leaders need to step up their game in terms of where globalization really is going to be today and in the future.
You mentioned China, and I want to move there next. But before you do, I have to add a personal aside here. I was on the advisory board of the Exim Bank at a time when GE was our biggest customer. So thank you for your business. Exim Bank, in my opinion, was a great organization and had a great mission. But you mentioned China. And you had a significant amount of personal experience in terms of China, what it's like to do business there. So I'd love for you to talk about that. In particular, also address this issue of intellectual property theft and how significant you think that is or was, but also a little bit about the future and what our country's approach ought to be in terms of China.
Maybe one of the biggest questions we can talk about, Steve, is China, because it's big and it moves quickly and it changes. It's also, I would say, generally poorly covered in the US in the context of, the Journal or the New York Times or CNBC. And I think, in the 30 years I've been kind of going back and forth, the relationships are challenging today for sure. Maybe the most challenging I've seen. Look, there's a military aspect that's really critical. There's probably better people than me to speak on that, and I understand how important that is. And I think the cyber challenges, again, going back to public safety, those are also challenging. So let me state that from the outset. But if you're in the automotive business, the healthcare business, the aviation business, I could go down the list. The Chinese market's going to be bigger than the US. They've been graduating more engineers than the US and Europe combined for almost 30 years now. The fact is that, the bad news is they were probably guilty of taking technology in the past. They may not have to take technology in the future. That's the bad news, right? They're sophisticated in artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, all the technologies. They're going to be key in the 21st century. They're betting big on. They are doing what the Exim Bank used to do. So we all, Steve, you and I grew up in a world where having the U.S. As our helper around the world was a huge asset. That's kind of gone away. And now, China's, if you look at a power plant being built in Saudi or investments in agriculture in Brazil, the Chinese are making those investments today. We don't know the people that are there really anymore. So it's just a long-winded answer to say, I think this relationship is the most important relationship of the 21st century. We're better off being, I would say, constructive competitors than having kind of like an economic iron curtain, in this generation. And the last point I'd make is that it doesn't matter who the president of the United States is. The president of the United States isn't going to protect, economically, isn't going to protect Americans from China, right? It's just, maybe militarily they will, and we need them to, but not economically. So China's real. That's going to happen. Now, my students, Steve, I'm afraid that we're raising a generation of young people who feel like their careers don't need to encompass China, right? And that's not good. That's when you and I were growing in the corporate world, I basically knew that unless I figured it out in China, we weren't going to be successful. And so that was my task. I think business leaders today feel like they can say, well, it's just too hard, right? They're too competitive. I can't protect my IP, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a losing hand. So I really believe that, kind of coming up with, if you're a business leader, your own strategy for China, and if you're in the administration, a way to be competitors, but still be interrelated in a positive way, that's key. The last thing, again, this is too long-winded, Steve, but if climate change is your issue, China is going to solve it. They're a big part of the solution.
So a little earlier, you talked about the phone call you made to your, at the time, largest shareholder. And in the book, you talk about an instance of your relationship with what I'll call an activist shareholder. I'd be interested to know your thoughts based on your experience with activist shareholders and how they can either be helpful or not so helpful, and what you do about that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think some of the challenges that GE had weren't created by activists, so it would be wrong to paint it that way. In my experience, cutting costs, replacing leaders, selling businesses, there's 3 or 4 plays that activists can make. And if those fit the business model that you need, they can be pretty constructive. But if they don't fit the business model, they just pull a company inward. And I've seen this in a handful of cases. And sometimes you can get pulled inward, and that's not a bad thing. But when you're in tough markets, bad markets, getting pulled inward so that you're meeting with the board and the leadership team's not selling and everybody's worried about their own job and their own career and their own reputation, that's really a challenge. And probably the only solution is a unified board, right? So the only solution is a unified board that kind of is willing to stand their ground, willing to be criticized. The thing they do better than anybody on earth is they have the best communicators. They have really sharp elbows, and it's just a lot of time, boards want to be anonymous, and they're not going to let the board be anonymous. They're going to really make it excruciatingly difficult And again, all that can be good when things are stable, but when things are unstable, if you're going through COVID with an activist writing sidecar, that's really hard, right? That's 10 times harder than just going through a crisis like that on your own. So there's a reason why they exist. I can't, most of my problems were of my own making, if not all, so I'm not going to blame them for that. They have a limited playbook, and if your company doesn't fit that playbook, they pull you inward at the very worst times. So
you talked about the importance of the board. How has the role of a board of directors, if any, changed from even just the time when you took over in September 2001 until today?
Yeah, look, I think boards are always important. I think keeping boards focused on strategy and people and risk, is really the critical aspect. Getting them to see companies when the CEO is not around, and being able to get to know and see people and how companies work and things like that is really key. I'd say there's a lot more emphasis today on checklists, whether they come from ISS or external groups, about kind of how the board works, what it has to do, the amount of things that get filled out, things like that. That's completely different. But I think, Steve, that the critical context everybody has to have is you have to imagine your board in the worst day, right? You can't imagine your board like when things are working. You have to look around the boardroom and say, okay, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt today. What are we going to do? And if you can somehow simulate, if you're chairman or even a board member or even a CEO, if you can somehow mentally simulate what happens on that really bad day, and you can envision who cares more about their own reputation than about the company, who's actually been reading all the memos that they've asked for, who knows the company strategy, I guarantee you that's not 100% of all board members. It may not even be 50%. That's what everybody has to be doing. And I'm not sure that ISS or anybody else is really helping you simulate that, because bad things happen, right? In good days, boards are great. But in 2009, Ralph Larson turning to me in the middle of a board meeting in front of my team and saying, Jeff, we're going to cut the dividend to where it needs to be. I've heard enough. You go get it done, and I'm tired of listening to you. That's a hero. Okay. That's and fortunately, I had a person like Ralph or Roger Pinsky or Shelley Lazarus on the board who could, in the times that mattered most, deliver kind of the right kind of messages in the right way, versus other people, well-meaning people who just didn't know enough or didn't have enough self-confidence or cared more about themselves than the company. And they all exist in boardrooms.
You talk in the book about the solitary nature of the CEO job. And also you talked in the book about avoiding the problem of a CEO in a bubble. How did you try to balance and deal with those two potential problems?
Yeah, look, if you're a CEO and you run a really good company with good leaders, you can sit in a day and the phone not ring, right? So you really, you have this kind of odd paradox of wanting people that are great, that can do their own work without you, but at the same time, needing to be in the ebb and flow of kind of what's going on in the business. I think one of the most important things, Steve, that CEO, any leader can do is control their own schedule. So, I always try to spend time outside the country, to spend time with customers, to spend time with technologists, so in factories, so that I could see what was really going on and could have my own point of view. We always had very disciplined meeting structures so information could flow fluidly. Starting in 2010, I would bring one senior leader per month with their spouse to have dinner with us on a Friday night and spend 5 hours on a Saturday morning going through where they were in their career, what their business was doing, but also what they thought of the company, what they changed and what they liked, what they didn't like. So forming those connections. And one of the things I really, even I work with founders now and a couple CEOs, and they all say, I could do so many other things, but I don't have control of my time. And I say, you're the boss, right? You have control over everything, particularly your time. So for 35 years, I never let my assistants schedule me. I always approved every meeting, every session. And I just think that the way you can stay engaged is by controlling your schedule and making sure that you're in the flow. You can develop a point of view, you develop connections, and that's really critical. And not be a victim to people using digital technology to schedule you in a way that you just can't get anything done. You can't think anymore, and that's a negative.
In the book, you spend a lot of time talking about lessons learned, mistakes that were made, including things you wish you had done differently. Looking back with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, of course, what would you say is your biggest disappointment about your tenure as CEO at GE?
Yeah, Steve, I hired a co-author, which was one of the smartest things I did, because what we really try to do is just tell a story, tell a series of stories, and let readers make their own judgments about what you would have done differently and things like that. I think one of the things I learned in the process is that everybody remembers the 70% of every story where they're the hero, but they don't remember the 30% where they're a jerk. And so giving my co-author, access to 75 or 80 people who could help fill in the stories. And, what we try to do is not just say, here's what we saw, here's what we did, but also here's what we felt, here's how we felt as we were going through it. In terms of, looking back, I think that the letting GE Capital grow to be the size it was in 2008, that was a decision I made. And that, because of its size, relative size and absolute size during the financial crisis, really hurt the company, not just for a year or two, but for a long time. And if you went back to the early 2000s, that was a change that, we probably could have made. And that's what I'd clearly have done differently, just not because of what it was situationally, but what it meant over a generation. I think that's probably the biggest one. And then, it's because I don't think it's unique to our company. I think it's unique to every company, because I see it today in all the companies I'm in, which is, when you're around people you trust, it doesn't matter how bad the days are, good things happen. You make it through. And when you allow a few people in that you just don't trust because they have other attributes, or you're just too busy doing other things, or there's other situations, it always ends badly. And I regret allowing a few people that I just didn't trust as much. And in the end, that both relationship and those attitudes really hurt the company. And, every company I work with now, Steve, has a few people, so it's not unique to us. But I would just, when I talk to other CEOs, it's not about loyalty. It's something people mistake with loyalty. It's about having people who always put the company first. We talked about 9/11 earlier, and there was a vice chairman of GE at that time named Dennis Derriman. And it wasn't like Dennis Derriman wasn't necessarily loyal to me. He was loyal to GE. Keith Sharon was my CFO for a long time. Keith wasn't, he liked me. We were friends, but he was loyal to GE, right? Mike Neal ran GE Capital during the financial crisis. He was loyal to GE, right? I could go down the list of people. And so I think that's the context I would give people. Business situation on GE Capital, I wish I had done differently. And at the end of the day, if you're in business, you love people but they still break your heart. And that's just the way it goes.
What are you most proud of?
Oh, we were a great global company, Steve. I think we forged a path. We did it through multiple generations and cycles. But if you went, in every country, we had local people. We did really meaningful things in the country. And, frequently when the Financial Times or others would do polls of respected companies around the world, GE would be in the top 5 in maybe 40 or 50 countries around the world, right? So I think that was really great work done by the team.
And you touched on this briefly early in our discussion, but why did you decide to write the book, and why now?
Yeah, so I things in the way I wanted them to, clearly at GE, and it's a complicated story and a complicated tenure. But over the last, and I had plenty of time to think about it, and I'm doing things today that are rewarding and I love, right? So I feel fulfilled. But when I saw the way the stories had been told, I just felt like, I worked with hundreds of thousands of really dedicated people, and I didn't like the way the aggregate of all of our work was being portrayed. And I didn't think it was right, and I didn't think it was fair. And truth equals facts plus context. That's the way we started this conversation. The context had gone missing, Steve. And so that's what I tried to provide. All the money from the book is going to my high school. And I've literally heard from hundreds and hundreds of GE people who have said, thanks for writing the book. Beyond that, I just think that, anything we can share that helps people get perspective of how to lead through these difficult days. I think our stories kind of help people in that context as well. And that's another piece of the reason to write the book, is just, I have students now. They don't want to read, here are the 7 jewels of leadership. They don't want to read that book. So if you're out there writing that book, stop. They want to know, like, how do you figure it out? What do you do when things go wrong? And that's, that's part of it too. There's not a day that doesn't go by that I don't think about GE, that I don't, I'll carry a notion that I let some people down. I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life in a meaningful way. But at the same time, when things are against you, you still have to keep going. And that's what I'm trying to do as well.
Jeff, I have one more question. In the book, you disclose to the world that you have a tattoo. And I'd like to know if there's anything else. I'm going to give you the opportunity to make news. If there's anything else that you'd like to tell us, the Westport Library would love to be one of the newsmakers. So this is your chance.
Listen, I'm going to let the tattoo just stand on its own. Steve. I think that's a great story in the book. But look, I think in Westport, there's a lot of people that care about the company. I'm still a big investor in the company. I'm not an insider in any way, but I still buy G stock. I still believe in the company's future. So I hope the people in Connecticut feel the same way.
Jeff, thank you for your time. Thanks for the book. It really, I appreciate and admire your candor in the book, and the great stories. It's a collection of stories that combined really make for a great narrative. So
great.
Thank you very much for that. And now I'll turn it back to Jennifer.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you both so much, Jeff and Steve. This was a fantastic conversation, and I learned so much about business and just being a human. So thank you very much. For those of you watching at home, the book Hot Seat will be available still through the link that's on the webpage that you registered through. It will have a signed book plate in it if you order it from us tonight. And thank you both so very much for sharing your time and energy with us. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Steve. And thanks again for everything.
Thank
Good
you,
luck.
Jeff.